What you're about to hear is not the version that usually appears in books or movies. This is a story that was silenced for a long time, and one that still makes people uncomfortable. If you want to understand what really happened to the Apache, stay until the end. Subscribe to the channel, because this is not an isolated story. Before the word Apache ever existed, before maps, borders, and military reports, there was already us. Not as a single block, not as a caricature shaped by the invaders' fear, but as families, clans, and paths that moved with the wind, the seasons, and the need to survive in a world that was always demanding. Official history usually begins when someone from the outside arrives, observes, names, and writes. But our origin does not begin there. It begins long before, in a time when the land did not need to be conquered because it already recognized us as part of itself. We are descendants of peoples who walked for countless generations, coming from the north long before any flag was planted in the soil. We did not migrate by chance. We followed signs, changes in climate, in game, in the very breath of the earth. What is now called displacement was, for us, adaptation. Archaeology speaks of movements, dates, and remnants. Our memory speaks of necessity, wisdom, and survival. When the cold tightened its grip and resources shifted, we moved forward, not as fugitives, but as attentive readers of the natural world. The desert, later described as empty and hostile, was never empty to us. It always spoke. Every rock, every canyon, every hidden spring carried information. We learned to hear where others saw only silence. We learned to live where others believed survival was impossible. That is why, when the first foreigners arrived, they looked around and did not see us. And by not seeing us, they concluded that we did not exist. That was the first erasure. We did not call ourselves Apache. That name was given to us by others, and like many imposed names, it carried intention. Some say it meant enemy, others say it was merely a borrowed word from neighboring peoples. It hardly matters. The effect was the same. Many identities reduced to a single label. Easier to fear, easier to fight, easier to justify. By accepting that name, official history forced us into a fixed role, as if we had always been the same, as if we had no history before conflict. But we had our own names, our own stories, territories that did not require fences to exist. Our maps were not drawn on paper, they lived in collective memory, passed down from generation to generation. We knew where water emerged, where game traveled, where danger usually slept. This knowledge was not individual, it was shared. And perhaps this is what written history never truly understood. We were not a people guided by a single leader or a single idea, but by a deep sense of balance. When European records began to speak of us, it was already too late. They encountered us in motion, reacting, defending. They never knew us in silence. They never saw us in times of extended peace, because their very presence disrupted that state. Everything they wrote was filtered through tension, fear, and the need to justify expansion. They did not write about our origin to understand it, but to control it. That is why so many questions remain unanswered in the books. Where did we truly come from? Why did we choose certain territories and not others? What was our life like before the wars? These questions did not interest those who were writing. History needed to begin at the moment of conflict, because a people without a past is easier to dominate. A people presented as if they emerged from nowhere appears to have nothing to lose. But we had everything to lose. We had bonds with the land that went beyond possession. The land was not property, it was kin. Leaving it was not a strategic decision, it was a spiritual wound. That is why we resisted so fiercely. Not for glory, not for violence, but because abandoning the territory meant abandoning who we were. This part of our origin rarely appears in traditional studies because it does not fit into military reports or political treaties. When people speak today about the origin of the Apache, they often simplify. They say we were nomads, as if that meant a lack of roots, but movement was our root. Remaining did not mean standing still. It meant keeping the relationship with places alive. That nuance was lost, and in its place remained the image of a wandering people without ties, almost temporary. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is that before we were called a threat, we were already a complete people, with rules, values, spirituality, and memory. Official history avoided telling this because acknowledging our full origin would mean acknowledging that we were not an obstacle to progress, but a civilization that already existed. And admitting that would require admitting guilt. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Without understanding who we were before the name Apache, no war makes sense, no resistance appears legitimate, and no pain is fully understood. Our origin is not an irrelevant prologue. It is the key that dismantles the entire narrative built afterward. When foreigners began advancing through what they now call the Southwest, they believed they were entering empty land or territory that was barely occupied. It was a convenient illusion. The desert already had owners, even if we did not use fences, stone markers, or documents to prove it. Our dominion was not imposed by appearance, but by knowledge. Every route had a purpose. Every water source was protected by silence. Every narrow passage between mountains was watched long before any outsider realized they were being observed. The invasion was not sudden. It was slow, confident, and deeply mistaken. The first encounters were not immediately violent. There was curiosity, cautious distance, mutual observation, but it quickly became clear that these men did not understand the land as we did. To them, land was something to be owned, exploited, divided, and renamed. To us, land was something to be respected, listened to, and preserved. That clash of worldviews was the true beginning of the conflict. There was no formal declaration of war because there was no recognition that a war was taking place. To the invaders, advancing was a natural right. To us, it was a violation. The desert, which had protected us for generations, became their first great obstacle. They marched in predictable lines, carried heavy supplies, relied on inaccurate maps and guides who rarely understood the territory completely. We needed to carry nothing beyond what was necessary. We knew where to find water even in the driest seasons. We knew trails invisible to untrained eyes. We understood how to disappear when the situation required it. This was not magic. It was the result of long coexistence with an environment that demands respect in order to allow survival. As settlements began to appear, they brought fences, cattle, and a strange logic of forced permanence. Places that had always been natural corridors for hunting and movement became forbidden zones. Water sources were claimed as if they had always belonged to whoever arrived last. Every fence raised was a silent provocation. Every introduced animal altered the balance of the land. What the colonizers called progress, we felt as suffocation. We did not react immediately because we believed, perhaps naively, that there was enough space for everyone. But the advance never stopped. Where one settlement appeared, another soon followed. Routes were closed, water sources dried up, and when we approached to reclaim what had always been ours, we were seen as intruders. It was at that moment that the narrative began to reverse. We went from original inhabitants to threats to the newly imposed order. Foreign accounts describe unexpected attacks, cruel ambushes, violence without warning. What they do not say is that every attack had a reason, every ambush was preceded by a violation, every act of resistance was a response. We did not attack villages for pleasure. We attacked to remind them that the land was not unoccupied, that the silence of the desert did not mean the absence of watchful eyes. Invisibility, for us, was always a form of protection, not cowardice. The war that took shape did not follow the rules known to the armies that tried to confront us. There were no clear front lines. There were no formal battles. The entire territory was the battlefield. The invader never knew where the next blow would come from because they did not understand that the environment itself was part of our strategy. We fought where we knew every detail and withdrew when necessary, without the notion of defeat that outsiders insisted on assigning to us. For us, survival was victory. Over time, the invaders' frustration turned into fear, and fear turned into dehumanization. They began to call us savages because we did not obey their rules. They called us thieves because we reclaimed what had been taken from us. They called us murderers because we refused to die in silence. Official history chose these words because they justified the violence that would follow. It is easier to exterminate those who are no longer seen as human. Yet even under increasing pressure, we maintained our logic. We did not seek to conquer new lands, only to prevent ours from being completely swallowed. Every strategic retreat was an attempt to buy time. Every temporary agreement was a hope for coexistence that rarely materialized. Promises were made and broken with equal speed. Treaties were signed and ignored as soon as they ceased to be convenient. The written word, so valued by the invaders, proved fragile in the face of ambition. This period marked an irreversible transformation. The territory that once defined us began to turn into a constant battlefield. The desert, our silent ally, became the stage for pursuits, manhunts, and displays of force. And yet, we remained, invisible when we needed to be, present when it was impossible to ignore us. The invasion was never complete because we never ceased to exist. Understanding this moment is essential to understanding everything that came afterward. We were not a people who chose war. We were a people pushed into it by the refusal of others to recognize limits. Official history avoids this detail because it dismantles the idea of heroic conquest. It reveals that expansion was only possible through the systematic denial of those who were already there. And it was in this environment of constant tension and progressive invasion that the image of the Apache as a permanent threat was born. An image built not from who we were, but from the fear we inspired in those who insisted on taking what had never belonged to them. At some point in the conflict, something changed. It was no longer enough to take the land, control the routes, and surround the water sources. Something deeper became necessary, controlling the narrative. That was the moment when the figure of the savage Apache was born. Not as a neutral description, but as a deliberate construction. A label created to turn resistance into barbarism, defense into cruelty, survival into an irrational threat. Official history needed this character to function because without it, the violence inflicted upon us would have had no moral justification. The earliest written accounts by soldiers, missionaries, and settlers rarely describe context. They spoke of attacks, but did not mention the provocations. They spoke of ambushes, but ignored the invasions that came before them. They spoke of deaths, but remained silent about entire villages massacred, about women and children killed in their sleep, about prisoners used as examples. By removing the cause and showing only the reaction, the narrative became simple. There was a cruel enemy that needed to be eliminated. This simplification was not a mistake, it was a choice. Over the years, reports repeated themselves, inflated numbers, attributed atrocities without proof, and merged distinct events as if they were a single pattern of violence. The Apache ceased to be seen as human and came to be treated as a force of nature, something between a wild animal and an inevitable disaster. This dehumanization had direct consequences. Once someone is no longer seen as a person, any action against them begins to seem acceptable. What is striking is that many of the same documents that called us savages also admitted, albeit indirectly, our discipline, our organization, and our strategic ability. They spoke of the constant fear of advancing through the territory, of the impossibility of predicting our movements, of the frustration of facing an enemy that did not follow conventional rules. Yet these qualities were never recognized as intelligence or adaptation. They were always reinterpreted as treachery, cowardice, or cruelty. We were denied victory even in the recognition of skill. The image of the bloodthirsty Apache grew stronger because it served many interests. For governments, it justified long and costly military campaigns. For settlers, it legitimized the occupation of land and the expulsion of entire communities. For the press of the time, it sold stories filled with fear and drama. Whether they were true hardly mattered. What mattered was that they reinforced the idea that there was an evil to be fought, and we were chosen to occupy that role. What is rarely mentioned in these accounts, however, is the internal logic behind our actions. We did not attack indiscriminately. There were codes, collective decisions, careful assessments of risk. Many attacks specifically targeted supplies, horses, and weapons. The goal was to weaken the capacity for advance, not to exterminate populations. When civilian deaths did occur, they almost always happened in contexts of direct conflict, pursuit, or retaliation for prior aggression. Violence was never gratuitous. It was always tied to survival. Official history avoids this nuance because it breaks the myth. A people who respond with logic and discernment cannot be reduced to savagery. A people who fight for their territory after repeated betrayals cannot be called irrational. Acknowledging this would require re-examining who truly practiced systematic violence, and that re-examination would challenge the heroic image of expansion. Another fundamental element was the use of European religion and morality as the standard by which our customs were judged. Anything that did not fit those standards was automatically labeled barbaric. Our rituals, our relationship with death, our way of raising children, everything was seen as proof of inferiority. There was no genuine effort to understand. There was only comparison, always unfavorable to us. In this way, cultural difference became evidence of dehumanization. This construction of the savage Apache also erased our internal divisions, our debates, our disagreements. We were portrayed as a homogeneous mass, driven by a single violent impulse. This simplified the narrative, but destroyed the truth. Among us were cautious leaders, advocates of agreements, people who sought coexistence whenever possible. Many of these leaders were betrayed, killed, or discredited precisely because they did not fit the image the invader needed to preserve. Over time, this caricature hardened. It moved from military reports into school textbooks, then into novels, films, and popular stories. Apache became synonymous with danger, ambush, brutality. Few asked who had written this history, and in whose interest. Few recognized that a narrative repeated often enough eventually becomes accepted as truth, even when it is born from convenience. The most cruel part is that this image still echoes today. It shapes how we are remembered, how our history is taught, how our resistance is interpreted. Official history avoided telling who we truly were, because doing so would require admitting that the conflict was not a struggle between civilization and barbarism, but between occupation and survival. Dismantling the myth of the savage Apache is not an exercise in victimhood. It is an act of recovering historical dignity. It is the affirmation that we were not monsters born of the desert, but human beings placed in an impossible situation, responding with the means available to them. And this understanding is essential to grasp why, despite all the violence directed against us, we were never fully defeated. Because a people who fight to exist, even when turned into villains by history, carry a strength that cannot be erased by words alone. There came a moment when the invaders realized something unsettling. No matter how many soldiers they sent, how many expeditions they organized, or how many resources they spent, they were never able to fully reach us. This was not a conventional war. There were no definitive victories, no formal surrenders, no sense of control that armies expected to have at the end of a campaign. For them, this was deeply disturbing. For us, it was simply the continuation of a way of life that had always known when to appear and when to disappear. Our war was not fought with weapons alone. It began long before any physical confrontation. It started with silent observation, with reading tracks, with interpreting the enemy's behavior. We knew when a group was exhausted, when discipline began to break down, when confidence turned into carelessness. We did not attack on impulse. We waited. Time, for us, was always a weapon as powerful as any blade. The land was an extension of our bodies. Every hill, every canyon, every narrow trail carried strategic meaning. Where the invader saw only rock and sand, we saw shelter, advantage, and escape. We could cross regions considered impossible without leaving a trace. We could vanish in broad daylight and reappear where no one expected us. This created a kind of fear that did not come from brute force, but from unpredictability, a constant, corrosive fear that wore people down more than any direct battle. But there was something even harder to fight, our spirituality. For the foreigners, war and religion were separate things. For us, they were not. The struggle for the land was also a struggle for the continuity of the spirit. Before any confrontation, there was inner preparation. We did not fight with the body alone, but with the conviction that we were protecting something greater than ourselves. That certainty gave us a resilience the invaders could not understand. How do you defeat someone who does not see death as an end, but as part of a cycle? Our warriors did not seek personal glory. Recognition came from the community, not from medals or written records. Anonymity was a virtue. Many deeds were never attributed to a specific name, because what mattered was not who attacked, but what was preserved. This logic deeply confused the armies that faced us. They searched for leaders to capture, central figures to eliminate, believing that doing so would weaken the whole. They did not understand that our strength was not concentrated in a single point. Each attempt to subdue us followed a predictable pattern: confident advance, initial shock, growing frustration, forced retreat. Reports described exhausted soldiers, low morale, and constant fear of night attacks or ambushes in unlikely places. The enemy never knew whether they were being watched, and they usually were. This permanent surveillance was a powerful psychological weapon. Many gave up not because of wounds, but because of the mental exhaustion of never feeling safe. Official history often calls this guerrilla warfare, as if it were an improvised tactic. For us, it was simply coherence with the environment. We never had any interest in open battles that favored those with more men and more weapons. We fought where the advantage was ours, and that was not dishonor. It was intelligence. Survival was always more important than proving bravery according to standards imposed by others. As the years passed, the invaders began to realize they were not fighting only a people, but a way of existence that could not be easily dismantled. They could destroy villages, burn belongings, capture people, but they could not capture the knowledge of the land, nor erase collective memory. Every loss generated adaptation. Every apparent defeat taught something new. This ability to learn quickly was one of the reasons the war seemed endless. The fear we inspired did not come only from attacks, but from the sense of helplessness. An army accustomed to imposing its will found itself unable to fully control the situation. This wounded pride fueled hatred and hardened strategies. The more difficult it became to face us, the more brutal the attempts to break us grew. And when a just war fails, cruelty often takes its place. Still, we endured. Not because we believed final victory was guaranteed, but because giving up would have meant accepting the dissolution of our identity. Each generation learned from the one before it. Each child grew up understanding the value of silence, observation, and patience. The war shaped us, but it did not define us entirely. It was a response, not an essence. This period cemented something crucial. The Apache could not be defeated by weapons alone. This would become clear in the years that followed, when new strategies emerged, not to confront us directly, but to divide us, exhaust us, and isolate us. The invisible war was about to give way to something even more dangerous: organized betrayal. When the invaders finally understood that they would not be able to defeat us through military expeditions alone, the tone of the war changed. Direct force gave way to calculated cruelty. If they could not overcome us in open confrontation, they would try to break us from within. That was when betrayal became policy and persecution became method. The war ceased to be only about combat and turned into systematic attrition, a slow process aimed at destroying what kept us standing. Agreements began to appear more frequently. Promises of peace, guaranteed territory, possible coexistence. Many among us, exhausted from burying relatives and living in constant vigilance, wanted to believe, not out of naivety, but out of necessity. The survival of a people also includes the desire to interrupt the cycle of death. But these agreements were almost never meant to last. They were strategic pauses used to map, weaken, and prepare the next blow. Some leaders who trusted the written word paid with their lives. Others lost credibility among their own when the promises were broken. This produced something perhaps even more destructive than any battle: internal distrust. When no one knows whom to believe, the fabric of the community begins to tear. And this did not happen by chance. Division has always been more effective than direct confrontation. Manhunts began to intensify. This was no longer just about clashes between armed groups. Entire families were pursued. Bounties were offered for scalps, turning death into currency. Men who had never faced the Apache in battle began to hunt us like animals, driven by the promise of money or prestige. The dehumanization built over the years was now bearing its darkest fruit. The use of other indigenous peoples against us was one of the most painful strategies. They were promised protection, food, recognition. Brothers were turned against brothers, exploiting old rivalries or simply the need to survive. This practice left deep scars, not only physical, but spiritual. The pain of being betrayed by those who also knew loss is something history rarely records, yet it remains alive in memory. Deportations followed soon after. Removed from territories we knew as extensions of our own bodies, we were pushed into reservations that did not respect our way of life. Places where the land did not speak the same language, where natural cycles were unfamiliar, where survival required abandoning ancestral practices. This was not merely a geographic relocation, it was an identity rupture, a direct attack on cultural continuity. Many did not survive. Disease, hunger, and despair completed what weapons had failed to finish. Children grew up far from sacred places, learning to feel nostalgia for something they had barely known. Elders died carrying stories that would never again be told on the same ground where they were born. Each silent loss was a victory for those who wanted our disappearance without bearing the weight of an explicit massacre. And yet, even within this forced collapse, something endured. Memory could not be captured. Stories continued to be whispered. Rituals were adapted. Identity was wounded, but alive. We survived not because we were spared, but because we refused to vanish completely. Every attempt to erase us produced a new form of resistance, less visible, but no less powerful. Official history often treats this period as the end of the Apache question, as if defeat had been clear and final. But that is another convenient simplification. What occurred was not an ending, but a painful transformation. We were forced to change in order to continue existing, and that adaptation, though silent, was a form of victory that is rarely acknowledged. Looking back, it becomes clear that the defeat was not military. It was political, moral, and psychological. An entire system organized itself to make the continuation of a way of life impossible. And yet it failed to eliminate what truly defined us. Because a people do not live by land alone. They live by memory, by connection, and by an identity that resists even when everything around it tries to crush it. That was the highest cost of the war. Not only the loss of land, but the deliberate attempt to break the spirit. And that is precisely why the silence imposed afterward was so convenient. To speak about this period would require acknowledging methods that contradict the civilized image official history prefers to preserve. After the weapons fell silent, after the major campaigns ended and reports declared the matter resolved, something heavier than war followed: silence. Not a natural silence, but an imposed one. A silence carefully constructed so that what had happened would not need to be explained. Official history moved forward, celebrating conquest, expansion, and progress, while pushing our existence into footnotes, condensed chapters, and simplified versions. What was inconvenient to remember was left out. This erasure did not happen all at once. It was gradual, almost elegant. First, our history was reduced to conflict, as if everything we were could be summarized by battles and armed resistance. Then, that conflict was transformed into a closed episode, something belonging to a distant past with no connection to the present. Finally, our voices were replaced by external interpretations. We came to be studied, described, and analyzed, but rarely heard. The imposed silence was not only historical, it was cultural. Our languages were discouraged. Our rituals were seen as obstacles to integration. Our spirituality was treated as superstition. Schools taught sanitized versions of expansion, where indigenous pain appeared diluted, almost abstract. Children learned the names of battles, but not the names of displaced families. They learned dates, but not the human cost behind those dates. For a long time, this silence worked. Many believed we had disappeared, that the Apache existed only in old books, distorted films, or exaggerated stories. That was the intention. A people unseen in the present appear to have no right to the past, and a people without a recognized past cannot claim justice, land, or memory. But we are still here, adapted, wounded, transformed, but present. We survived on reservations, in cities, in scattered communities. We survived by passing down stories away from the spotlight, by preserving fragments of language, ritual, and identity. Every grandfather who told a forbidden story, every mother who taught an old song, every act of cultural resistance was an act against erasure. Official history avoided telling the Apache truth because that truth destabilizes comfortable narratives. It reveals that expansion was not only courage and pioneering spirit, but also systematic violence and the denial of humanity. It shows that treaties were broken not by accident, but by convenience. It shows that the celebrated civilization required the silencing of others in order to affirm itself. Acknowledging this demands more than academic revision. It demands moral responsibility. Today, when we speak about the origin of the Apache and everything that followed, we are not reopening wounds out of resentment. We are refusing silence. We are affirming that our history does not begin with war, does not end with defeat, and cannot be reduced to stereotypes. It is continuous, alive, and deeply connected to the present. What survived was not merely a name or a folkloric identity. What survived was a way of seeing the world, a relationship with the land, an understanding of community that endured even when pushed to the margins. This does not appear in traditional history books because it does not fit neatly into linear timelines, but it exists, and it persists. By telling this story now, we break the cycle of erasure. We show that what was avoided, distorted, or silenced still has a voice, and that voice does not ask for permission to exist. It simply continues, as it always has, moving through generations, adapting without disappearing. The true history of the Apache is not a story of an ending. It is a story of survival under conditions that should have made survival impossible, and perhaps that is precisely why it was avoided for so long. Because admitting that we survived is admitting that the attempt to erase us failed. And as long as there is memory, as long as there is someone willing to listen, this story will continue to be told, not as a distant echo, but as a living presence that refuses